Welcome to another episode of Tor on Air. And today I'm joined by Celine Halioua. I don't know if I got that right.
Halioua.
Halioua, founder and CEO of Loyal, dialing in from San Francisco. Welcome on the show.
Hi, thanks. Good to be here.
So Celine, looking at some of the things you've done in the past there, and kind of having a little pre-conversation with you, there's lots of different directions we can take this conversation to. I would say we start and we see where it takes us, and we may jump back and forth as well, because there's definitely lots of ground I would like to cover. Maybe just briefly, tell us what you do right now, what is Loyal, and, what were the steps sort of leading up to it?
Yeah. So I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Loyal, or Cellular Longevity. We're developing drugs to extend dog lifespan or health span. My kind of life goal is to get the first ever drug approved specifically for lifespan extension and health span improvement. Lifespan extension being the quantity, the number of years that, in this case, a dog lives, and health span being the quality of the life of those years. So longer, healthier years. And I pull that out because people always image like these zombie dogs. It actually be very difficult to make a dog live a long time in a bad state. They're kind of tied, these two. We're about, I think we actually just hit 30 on Monday, which is super exciting. We've raised about $11 million to date, based in SF, but kind of all over. We're a bit of a baby of the pandemic. We're 3 people before, order of magnitude larger now. I got into this in a very random, not direct path. Never thought I was going to be a founder. It was never really the thing I was optimizing for. Like, the thing I fundamentally always optimized for was trying to figure out how to develop better medicines for the worst diseases. The worst diseases being, in my opinion, age-related diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, many forms of cancer, things that are very difficult to treat once you already have them. And I became quite compelled by the idea that developing drugs against the mechanisms by which we age over time would be a more tenable way to develop medicines against these diseases. Happy to go back into any of that.
You studied in Austin, German dad.
Yes, Moroccan mom.
Moroccan mom, which I mentioned, for the European audience, and us being based in Berlin. You went on to do a PhD program at Oxford. Dropped out, like any good founder would do.
They're still not very happy with me about that.
and then ended up working at a VC fund, right, on longevity topics as well. And then, how did that path then from being at a VC? I saw you started as an entrepreneur in residence, then became chief of staff at the VC. How did that inform you around like wanting to actually build your own company? How did you approach it also? Maybe a little side note, I also started at a venture capital firm also as an entrepreneur in residence. And I remember, doing so, I kind of at one point felt like, well, this VC model, very top down, you look at markets and market sizes, and then you kind of drill it down into individual opportunities, investment opportunities. And my personal path was that I actually ended up really liking to do stuff more bottoms up. And that's, how my path basically unfolded. How was it for you when you started there? Do you already have an idea in mind, a market in mind, or, was it conversations with founders that you invested in that kind of led you to where you are now?
Yeah. So I'll start with the background, and also how I got to Longevity Fund, because I think that's actually very relevant, potentially for the audience. So I actually got into undergrad for art school. Again, really random path for how I got here. I actually worked in a neuro-oncology clinic in Bremen, where I met a number of terminal cancer patients, and just kind of had this like freak out when I realized you don't really have free will, because an otherwise healthy person can be secretly developing a disease and succumb to it, and there's nothing anybody can do with a certain subset of diseases. Like, doesn't matter how much money you have, how much effort you put in, how hard you try, you're just kind of done. And something about that really got to me. So I switched to neuroscience, thought I was going to be a doctor, kind of did the whole pre-med thing, which is kind of how you become a doctor in the US. You don't enter the program directly. And then had the opportunity to go to Oxford, and decided to do that for a couple of reasons. One, like transparently, I knew if I wanted to do ambitious things, having a little bit of social proof that I was smart was really important. People don't like to talk about that, but when there's millions and millions of people, you kind of have to figure out ways to kind of like hack the system a little bit. And that was like the first of many system hacks that I have done. And I also went because I was interested in the problem. I was working on the economics of expensive medicines. And basically, how do you economically incentivize preventative medicine in a single payer system like the NHS versus a multi-payer system like the US, which have their own pros and cons depending on how you look at the problem. And it was while I was there, I sent a cold email to Laura Deming, who's the GP at Longevity Fund, basically because I was curious in venture, not because of investing or entrepreneurship or anything. It just made sense to me, like a diversified portfolio theory to impact, right? Like instead of finding, one area of biology or one drug or one company or whatever that I thought would make the most sense to help people. In venture, you can invest in 20 companies, and then if 3 of them make and get a drug approved, and you've been a small part of kind of helping that number of patients have a better quality of life. So it made total sense to me. I sent her a cold email. I was like, hey, can I come? She said yes. I flew over. And then
She's
on the
also
last
quite
day,
the wonder kid, right?
yes,
I mean, her
definition
background
of a
already
wonder
is
kid.
like.
Yeah. So like the TLDR on that is she was in New Zealand. I think she was like 14 or something, reached out to a professor at UCSF, asked if she could work in this aging lab, did. Then she got something called the Thiel Fellowship, which is Peter Thiel gives people under, I believe, 21, $100,000 to drop out of college and build ambitious things. And she was in the first cohort of that and built a longevity fund. It famously raised about a $4 million first fund before she could sign the fund docs because she was under 18, and then raised another 25 or so, which is when I joined. So obviously, like really kind of, I don't know, it is rare to see women do something like that in a field like this. So I already kind of really looked up to her, and that was honestly why I reached out. And yeah, on my last day in SF, I was about to fly back to Oxford. She gives me a full-time job offer, and I have to decide basically on the spot if I want to.
And was that a cold email? Like, how did you reach out?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The power of cold emails, man. If you do them right, which is, there's a lot of good resources on this. I'm not going to harp on this, but if you do a good cold email right, it can get you far.
Well, share one of your hacks maybe on your email. Like,
Short.
You remember that email like you wrote to her?
I don't remember what it said, but in general, they need to be short, and they need to be empathetic to what the other person wants. And I need to give some sort of evidence, proof, anything you can that you are interesting, smart, ambitious, whatever it is. Like I get a lot of cold emails, but often there'll be these like diatribe, monotonic, things. And it's just like fundamentally like a busy person isn't going to read this as much as I would love to. And it only gets worse from there, right? Like I'm very not busy in comparison to some of like the busiest people in the world. So that's a really big thing, but also the empathy, right? It's not about you and what they can do for you. It's what you can do for them. And it's also luck. So numbers really help.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't lose faith if you don't get a lot of responses. But yeah, so I decided to leave Oxford, which was really difficult because my mom was very proud that I got into Oxford, and as a PhD student, I held a lot of like value to the idea of being at a tier 1, Ivy League, whatever university, right? It was a big jump from like where I grew up, which is not high-end suburbia Austin. With my mom's a substitute teacher, my dad's a carpenter, right? Like like that to like Oxford was a huge thing, so it was very difficult for me to give that up. But fundamentally, the reason why I decided to do it is because I felt like I was going to learn more at Longevity Fund that I was learning at Oxford. And in general, optimizing for rate of learning has always served me super well. And I think if you just optimize for that variable, like the way I look at it is like I'm trying to be embarrassed of myself a year ago, which is like maybe a bit negative, but I found that really helped. But yeah, anyhow, so left Oxford. Worked at Longevity Fund. I was absolutely terrible at the job for a really long time because it turns out there's a lot about working in Silicon Valley, working in venture, working in companies that have nothing to do with how smart you are, how much context you have about science. A lot of it is social, a lot of it is people, a lot of it is pattern matching, a lot of it is communication style. And I was coming from Oxford and Texas, where people are like super smiley and happy. And in Oxford, they're super verbose and academic and formal. And these things all pattern match terribly in San Francisco. In SF, it's all about being concise, about being having a lot of information in density in the words. It's about the right mix of apathy and enthusiasm and social proofing, but not too much, because that shows you're an amateur if you do too much of it. It's like there's a whole thing that you kind of
But would
just
you
have
say
to be
it is
here to
more?
learn.
Would you still say it is more social proof than we see in Europe? And I mean, this is also an intriguing conversation, maybe for,
Yeah.
you know, without making it too stereotypical, but like what I often hear, you know, Americans, you know, tell sort of German founders, you know, is to be, you know, better at creating that story, that narrative, also the goal setting, the vision, you know, just, you know, to think bigger. And, you know, often for, I think, Europeans, you know, that, you know, kind of way that we see in Silicon Valley being sort of so prominent is something that also Europeans maybe are a little put off by at times,
Mm-hmm.
right?
I don't blame them. I'm put off by it. Like, I don't like it. But you just have to, like, this is strategic conservatism, I think, is really important. You
Yeah,
can't blow up the system when you're nobody.
yeah.
You got to have a lot of money, you got to have influence, you got to have something, right? Or you're just going to be yelling in the corner and no one's going to listen to you.
Mm.
Like, I very transparently, and I'm pretty candid about this, I prefer Europe to the US. I've felt more at home living in Europe than I ever did in the US. I never have in the US, and it was very difficult for me to leave Oxford, partially for this reason. My life, non-professionally, was like perfect in England.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's like, okay, I can like try and like push the boulder uphill trying to do this from England and have a, you know, 10x harder time, or I can take all the advantages I can, which for me was like going to Silicon Valley and learning how to pattern match and all those things. And then if and when I'm successful as loyal or my next thing or whatever it is, then I can use that influence to bring a bit more of entrepreneurship community, venture dollars, etc., different pattern matching to Europe, to different types of founders, right? And that's something that's really, I really want to do in the future. But you got to pick your battles.
And probably in the US, like that, you know, you being transparent on that, like people don't take this stuff personal, right? It's not like, oh, you know, there's somebody kind of trying to, you know, maybe leverage the system. And then, you know, like it seems like it's very pragmatic in that way in the US.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, like, people don't like to talk about it, but fundamentally, I think like everyone who's done anything in Silicon Valley like knows this is the case.
Yeah.
And there need to be clear, like there has to be substance behind the stories, behind the patterns. Like, you're not going to get very far if you don't. But it's like fundamentally what I've been really good at is being a chameleon, to be able to then facilitate my ideas, which are like very hard earned, like very, very legitimate ideas, right? But I don't have, you know, hours to convince somebody of like the ideas that I have. I have 30 minutes, right? And so then you kind of have to mix both the variables in if you want to have people to have conviction in you.
And what was maybe some of the advice you got, or, you know, the patterns that you deciphered yourself that became really the ramp towards the success that you have now experienced in the beginning of Loyal, raising money and you know, building out this vision?
Yeah, so I think so the biggest one for me, and it's going to just be biased for what my weaknesses were before I came to the Valley. For me, it was in the communication style. So how I often downplayed my intelligence. And I think this is partially actually from growing up in Texas, where a lot of I always felt uncool because I didn't like follow the football games and you know, whatever. So often like dialed it back a lot and made myself just, I don't know. I wasn't like forthcoming with my ideas ever. Versus in Silicon Valley, people talk about their ideas a lot, and it's actually like, honestly, like social capital often is like interesting ideas that, and then, you know, you hear about them over time, and then you can say that like, oh, I heard about the idea like, you know, 2 years before it became a company or whatever. So that was a big one. I think it was also just like patterns of speech. So what I always recommend to people coming into the Valley for the first time is to listen to all of like the Y Combinator podcasts. The content's good and all, but the reason why I think you should like really listen to them is because they all talk very similarly. They all reply to questions in a similar way. They all have a similar level of conciseness. They all have a similar level of structuring their sentences to be clear for the person. And when I started that, plus some body language aspects, like when I started doing that, like when I first moved here, I heard many times that people thought I was unintelligent, then got to know me and then realized I was smart. But that's really bad because first impressions are like make or break. Again, when you're coming from zero and nobody has a reason to give you a second impression.
But why do you think they would think that? I mean, given your, CV and.
I mean, a lot of people have good CVs is the thing. Like a good CV is table stakes, honestly. And honestly, often it's like pattern matched against, right? So you could say that like me going to Oxford was because I was like conformist or whatever, or like playing like like basically it's just there's like certain successful, like it's a set of certain successful founders that people made a lot of money off of, or had a lot of success with, that now they subtly, consciously or subconsciously, pattern match to them when they're looking at the next generation. And it's always just generation after generation, like you're modeled after the previous one. And so the one, I think it's changing again, but like when I first came in, it was really pattern matched off of these like famous YC founders who made it, which are very different from a bubbly, at that time, like 24-year-old female scientist lady, right? It was just like a very different personality. It's like hyper intellectual, it's like another thing, right? Like always referencing your mental models and the book you read and which is like not really I don't like to intellectually flagellate like that. But it's again like a model that people fit to.
And do you think though that I mean that in itself becomes conformitist, right? And like this whole, let's say, Silicon Valley seems, and this shouldn't all, sound negative at all, like this is not the point, I think, of this conversation. What I'm interested in is really, and what we've been interested in for a long time at Tor is, looking at how can one engineer innovation ecosystems. Is that even possible? And if so, how? We've done other conferences in other parts of the world, especially in developing countries, and we're really interested in this idea of, how can you replicate, what is truly the, absolute leader in terms of, innovation being spurned out of this, very small part of the world called Silicon Valley. But do you think that like, being so monothematic also, the kind of, full concentration on technology, on software, even specifically, not being as culturally diverse as other parts, is that like, a part of its success? And you think that in the future, we may actually see that technology ecosystems will emerge more and more in places that are more diverse in thought as well?
Yeah. So I mean, to be clear, I'm very candid about the stuff because it like took me 2 years of paying to learn it, and transparently, like I wouldn't have had time to learn it if I wasn't like able to figure out how to pay, insane amounts of rent every month here, right? And I would have had to give up, go back to Oxford, and like I think most people would have had that situation happen to them, and I think it does happen all the time. So I try to be candid about it because
100%,
knowledge is power.
Yeah.
But to be clear, like it's not like it's far from like purely negative, or even like majority negative. I would say it's actually like I'm a much better thinker, I'm a much better communicator, I'm a much better storyteller, I'm a much better captivating an audience than I ever was before I came here. And it also facilitates, again, there's this like openness to ideas and to new people. Like, to be clear, like there is a currency in Silicon Valley, which is finding the next, person who's going to do something ambitious before anybody else has, and being like the one who supported them before anybody else did. Like that is literally a currency here. And so there's this huge energy, and everybody has a story, by the way, of somebody who believed in them before anybody else did. I mean, I have Laura as the obvious one for me,
Yeah.
but there's quite a few other people too who have like really like, put their neck on the line for me. And I will literally never forget that. Like these people are, I am indebted to them in the best way possible forever. But it also means that I now am always going to give back,
Sure.
and however I can, because somebody did it for me. And this is a culture that I haven't found anywhere else. And again, you have to like pattern match, but it's like, the pattern is so ephemeral, and it isn't based off of things that like for example, it's not like going to Oxford like may or may not be helpful, but if you went to like some random ass school but you did like a really cool thing, like that fits it just as well.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's not about degree, it's not about money necessarily, it's not about all these things that are often very restrictive.
Yeah.
Versus like on average, one thing I noticed about living in England is like it was very like classist,
Sure.
honestly. And it was like very difficult. Like you couldn't crack through it. Like good luck, right?
Yeah.
Like you
Yeah.
didn't come from the right school, you
Yeah.
didn't have the right accent. And really nice thing about Silicon Valley is like none of that matters. Like nobody cares about that. People care about the how good your ideas are and how good you are communicating them and how high potential you are. So they do lean on patterns, but they lean on patterns that are a lot more like you can't game how rich your parents were,
Yeah.
but you can game, talking about your ideas in a certain way.
Yeah.
I think that's why you have such innovation here.
Totally. I mean, in England, just as a funny anecdote, like even Eton and Harrow have different accents, right? Which are like sort of the two most famous private,
Mm-hmm.
or how they call them, public schools. I still wonder though, like if this kind of monothematic kind of focus, from an ecosystem perspective, not from like a single founder or a company perspective or even a technology perspective, but more from a wider societal perspective. Whether that has carried more kind of positive sum and benefits to it, or whether some of the issues that we've seen around also the erosion of democracy and the role that big tech plays into it, um,
Yeah.
is a side product of also that very heads down monothematic focus on innovation almost at all cost.
Yeah, no, I mean yeah, 100%. It, I mean, yeah, like I
And how
mean, if
does
you
one
look at
guard
the
oneself against that? Do you have kind of like checks and balances then in place? Do you like, if I stay here for 10 years and if I go, fully down that thought train, then maybe I will not build the product that, is best for society? Is that something you ever think about?
yeah, I mean, I think about it a lot. Like I have a very like servitude mindset
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to life. Like I really like fundamentally believe that I exist just to kind of facilitate development of better medicines and quality of life improvement, and all of that. I've felt that way since I was a kid. And so I guess I can't empathize as much because I've never felt in danger of,
Mm-hmm.
like it's very difficult to, unless you did bad science or became fraudulent, it's very difficult to go like putting money and putting energy and putting time and attention on science and bio and drug development is only positive, really.
Mm-hmm.
I do think a lot of people here, maybe not a lot of people, I don't know if I have evidence for that, but let's say it is a risk here to become like power drunk,
Mm-hmm.
status drunk, money drunk. There's a lot of like ego inflation that happens in the valley, partially because everybody likes to celebrate everyone, also partially because like manipulating somebody's ego is a great way to get what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and
That's a good point.
there's often more linear paths to following that in things that are not obviously good
Mm-hmm.
problems to work
Mm-hmm.
on, right? I think that there isn't often always a culture from the leaders of asking like, should we? You're right. It's like kind of progress at all costs. Which again, I think if you're going to bias one way or another, it's better to bias towards action. And I really appreciate the bias towards action that Silicon Valley has. But yeah, I think it's very important also to kind of reflect and think about like what you're working on. Um, and I think we're starting to see that a little bit more. Like there's more interest in complicated, impactful problems now in the Valley than the, I wasn't here 10 years ago, but just from like looking at the funding history of like the fields that I'm interested in, the deep tech fields I'm interested in, like there's a lot more money going towards them now than there was 10 years ago. But I don't know if it's a product of just there being more money in general or of people becoming more cognizant of real world problems.
And let's shift gears towards sort of, what you're doing, building a biotechnology company there. I mean, scanning your website was really illuminating. You share a lot of the learnings, which I think is great and is really worth checking out for everybody listening to the podcast. You talk, I mean, there's lots of stuff to talk about, but I really like how you sort of think about like applying tech frameworks to biotech. And you write a little bit about the key differences that you see. I mean, how can we get more people excited to start biotech companies? And what are some of the tech frameworks that you see actually are not really applicable?
Oh yeah. So I guess to answer the first question of like how to get people excited, I think a lot of it's a context issue. There's just nobody in bio talks about bio. They don't talk, so biotech is in general, in my opinion, about 10, let's say 10 to 15, maybe 20 years behind tech and most of the themes that occur in like kind of the meta structuring of these companies. Like it's very incubation focused, kind of like the old guys club. It's the same few people who lead the companies. They all get the same money. They all kind of like, get the boys back together to go build this company or that company or that company, right? Which then they haven't really had the like revolution or whatever of founder driven companies nearly as strongly as you have in tech now, right? Like tech almost is like too founder friendly. You could argue, I'm not saying I necessarily have that opinion, but that's like a thing that has been floated. Versus in bio, it's really the opposite, which is one of the reasons I raised mostly for tech, is because in tech, people support me and the company, versus in bio, they would like maybe support the company, but probably not support me and probably like fire me after the Series B. So I think this is a problem I care about, because fundamentally, you don't want to have rate limiting steps in drug development so damn early. Like drugs already have a high rate of failure. Every drug that takes an extra year to get to market, there's an X number of people that die waiting for that drug, depending on what it's for. And I think people are really good at looking like, oh, this drug caused an adverse event, like there's the adverse event, just AstraZeneca or whatever, right? But people are very bad at quantifying in their head, every day that we don't have a vaccine, every day that we don't have a suitable therapeutic for COVID or whatever, X number of people on average die. And that's true for basically every big disease. And so I just never have understood the perspective that like bio is so uniquely difficult and so uniquely challenging that you have to have these like boys clubs to build these companies. So I'm transparent about like my building process because I want more people to get context. And that's like historically that was something that we saw in tech. I mean, this is like one of the reasons like Paul Graham is super famous, right? Is they really kind of democratized and built a culture and built around kind of information sharing and giving back and like publicly accessible information about building in these spaces. And so I'm just one person. I really hope more bio people. I've always said that like even if I've put out information there, even if it's I don't think it's wrong, but like even if it is, like hopefully it'll like piss off some biotech CEO, and then he can go write a better blog post saying all the reasons I'm wrong. But then when there's 2 blog posts instead of 0, right? So it's like only positive to put information out there, in my opinion. Maybe that's not, I don't know, maybe that's controversial. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing. It's just there's just like you have to read like FDA regulatory documents right now to get like context for a lot of these aspects of how to build a drug, and how to deal with the FDA and all of that. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I forgot your second question.
No. I was just, like the sort of the tech frameworks, but it may be too technical also. I think, people could check it out on your webpage, for everybody who's sort of interested in you made a really detailed comparison on sort of tech frameworks that kind of work and don't work for biotech. And then I thought it was also just interesting to read because it's a good summary of tech frameworks in general, right? And where are you now? Like, what's the stage of the, the product actually? And how did you then also
Yeah.
get to that idea of, fixing
Yeah.
aging for dogs or helping
Yeah. So,
dogs age
so I'm a
better?
huge animal person. I grew up with like 15 cats, 3 dogs, the whole thing. At a horse, like, Texas, and everybody had horses. But I never actually thought I'd start an animal company. It was it was kind of a thing where I was like, yeah, this is like a thing that I really care about, but I'm gonna put that to the side along with everything, the whole like sacrificial thing, whatever. Um, but no, I got this idea initially because I was working at Longevity Fund, obviously talking to a lot of companies developing drugs for aging, and they all kind of have the same pitch, which is, yeah, we found this drug, it extends mouse lifespan 30%, it's amazing, health span improvement, da 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 da. But oh no, like evil FDA says aging isn't an indication. You can't develop a drug for this. So we're just going to go and develop it for, I don't know, X specific, like monogenic pediatric disorder, has nothing to do with aging, but hits the same pathway, or there's all these like hype. And to be clear, like there's some companies that are doing this very, very well. But this is like still the continuous pitch, and it just didn't make sense to me that everybody was trying to develop aging drugs, and then trying to commercialize and validate them for things that were like fundamentally not aging. I was just like, I want to develop an aging drug for aging. I don't want to develop an aging drug for osteoarthritis. I don't want to develop an aging drug for cancer. I want to develop an aging drug for aging. And I then came to the conclusion that unless I had $1 billion, which unfortunately I do not, there wasn't really a way to go humans first, with the skill set and the resources that I had. And kind of slowly over time, and it was almost like a bit of a meme in the beginning, like I was very embarrassed to say the phrase dog longevity, um, kind of came to the conclusion that working on dog aging drugs was the perfect interception of all of these variables that I cared about, right? Like it was animals, which, like, huge animal person. It was also an unmet need, in terms of, I mean, we love our pets. I've had the tragedy of, a multitude of my pets dying, and the idea of, I don't know, I mean, it's always just seemed cruel that they have such short lifespans compared to us when they become family members. Biologically, it made sense. There were, like, relatively speaking, low-hanging fruit, to kind of go after first. From a resource standpoint, it was tenable. It's about $5 million to get a dog drug approved. It's about $500 million to get a human drug approved. So it's like very different dynamics there.
And would
And
that
there's
be
like a
sort of like
consumer
I
aspect.
mean, will it be sort of like a OTC? Is it a consumer brand, or is this something that veterinarians will?
So it's both.
Yeah.
So I'm really kind of like, the meta thing I'm excited about is, until basically recently, with like Moderna and whatnot, people A, don't understand big pharma, and B, kind of villainize it. And to be clear, like there's real reasons why they villainize pharma, but I think then that gets conflated with medicine and drug development, which I think actually people should be as excited about new medicines being developed as they are about space launches.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became really like obsessed with the idea of building a consumer friendly pharmaceutical company. So we are developing RX drugs. They're going through the FDA. They're not supplements, et cetera. But then I also want to build a consumer facing brand company, thing around these products to kind of educate people and also just get people excited about scientific, endeavors.
And like taking it a little bit out again to sort of the biotech space in general, like what are the sort of, for you, like the rail lines, I guess, or guidelines for to how to make decisions on ethical implications on where one should go and how far we should push the envelope of innovation here. Like how do you think about that, like when you
Oh,
look ahead, like 30, 40, 50 years?
yeah, I mean, I don't think we're going to get anywhere near an ethical question, to be transparent. We're not creating like transgenic dogs. We're not creating, dogs that might live to 150. Like it's really more about the prevention, the delay, the dampening of age-related diseases, which is like pretty, like we already do this, right? Like we already develop drugs once somebody has a disease or once a dog has a disease. We're just trying to basically do that more effectively. by treating them before the disease has occurred and therefore extend lifespan significantly. I think the ethical questions around loyal are going to come more around, and this is something that we're thinking about already, but in general is important, is access, right? I mean, this is like, one of the reasons I lived in Sweden for a while. One of the reasons I lived in Sweden is I wanted to experience a socialized healthcare system, same with the UK and NHS. And in general, healthcare access is super important to me. And in dogs, it's all cash pay. So there's really no insurance providers, or it's not widely adopted, I should say. So it's important that we do a lot of work in our manufacturing now to ensure like the cash price that our drug is will be like broadly accessible to the majority of people. Of course, it's not going to be free, so it won't be accessible to everybody. But do as best as we can on that. So I think that's the big ethical issue that's going to come from like any drug. I mean, we've seen it now with the Alzheimer's drug just got approved, very controversially through the FDA. It's $56,000 a year for like a drug that may or may not work. I think that's where the big questions are going to start coming from an ethical standpoint.
I mean, do you see? Yeah, sorry, no, go ahead.
I was going to addendum on this. This is like my big beef with the aging field, because they all like yell about 1,000-year lifespans and making somebody live even 150. It's like, we are not there. Like, cart before the horse. Like, we have not even made people like really reliably live to 100, and they just like turn it into this huge ethical debate when like fundamentally an aging drug is not an ethical debate. Like, an aging drug is a societal need so that people aren't decrepit in nursing homes for the last 20 years of their life. Right. So like people can have more healthy years as their family. Like, there is absolutely nothing controversial about an aging drug, and people just like make it controversial to be like, I don't know, get headlines or be spicy or whatever. It drives me nuts, because I think it actually like really holds back the field.
Yeah, we had Aubrey de Grey on the show, and Dr. Church also. So we've talked to a lot of the experts in the field, and yeah, some of them have a very sort of optimistic vision of where this could go to. But you would say that for you also the benefit is more around sort of improving the last years of the life rather than extending it. Is that?
Well, we're looking at both. The way an aging drug, I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses on how an aging drug will work, right? But like, I think the way I imagine it, and the way we kind of think about it from a therapeutic perspective, is just dragging out the healthy years, the healthy like middle mature years. So then maybe there'll also be a compression mortality, so like less time spent in like a decrepit or a disease state. But that if you have more healthy years and you extend lifespan, right? But then you also have an increase in health span. So that's why they're so interchangeable, and that's why it's not really you can have health span improvement without lifespan improvement, but you can't really have lifespan improvement without health span improvement.
Would you say that COVID has, for you as a person, working in the field of science and for the kind of discipline in general, do you think a silver lining of COVID is that people are more interested in science and scientific progress in general? Or do you think
1,000%?
Okay. Yeah. But we also lost a bunch of, the population to disinformation and I guess misinformation and but in general, you see it positively. And how can, what's the role of science in, getting that other also fairly large part, right, of the population? And we're still not fully vaxxed, and all nations now run into this issue also of people not wanting the vaccination anymore. Like, what's the role of science here? And you mentioned earlier in the interview also that often people don't communicate that much in your industry. And it's, to me as somebody outside that industry, it seems related, right? That it seems to be kind of that this industry that we just as general consumers or the general public don't really have so many insights in, and that may lead to some people kind of withdrawing or being also easily misinformed and disinformed.
Yeah, gosh. So I mean, to be clear, COVID, huge net negative. Silver lining is people kind of seeing what science can do. I think it's it was interesting to me actually that this was such a big issue in Germany because I always held
Hmm.
kind of European like everything at like such a higher regard than anything US. So it was a little bit disappointing, transparently. I think it is a problem with the scientific community. I think the scientific community is quite exclusionary. I think the scientific community, and I don't think it's on purpose, by the way. I think it's just kind of, it's on purpose in some aspects. It's also because a lot of money. It's like very secretive to develop these
Hmm.
things. I think it's also a high failure rate, so you don't necessarily want to be super loud about everything. Because 90% of drugs that go into trials fail. I think it's also just very complicated and complex. It's actually like one of the reasons why people struggle with concise communication and clear communication. And one of the reasons why they fit to it so much in Silicon Valley is because you can't do that unless you're a clear thinker internally,
Hmm.
unless you have a good way of thinking about problems, which like transparently, like most people don't. Most people are super convoluted when they think about problems. And that's, I think, true in the scientific industry.
By the way, I read
Yeah, I
that you
mean,
also said in one of your quotes I wrote down from your website, I don't think in a structured model based way, instead depend on instinct.
I'm very instinct
Which
based. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
which I was surprised to read. This
Yeah.
makes you prone to
It's
bias and not
changing a
thinking through
little.
problems completely. How do you
Yeah.
guard yourself against that? Like,
Yeah. So it's something I'm working on a lot now because transparently, like when you have a team, it's a little bit
mm,
different than when it's just like you. But I think honestly, like, I don't know, instinct has, from a personal development and career development perspective, instinct has served me very, very well. Like I think between, longevity fund and Oxford, I just had a strong gut wrenching instinct that I had to go to longevity fund. And I don't know if necessarily if I'd done a pro and cons list, if longevity fund would have won. Same with like starting this company. I was pretty like meh, 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 meh
mhm,
on it for months. And then just something switched in my head and I was like, I have to do this, this is what I'm gonna do. And then I was all in.
mm,
Right. And it wasn't necessarily like I didn't do, there wasn't like I wasn't, I don't know. I think sometimes I think it's instinct paired with like a very, very, very strong mission motivation. So I know like
mhm,
the outcome of my career I want is to improve human health. And it's really about finding that best path. And then the instinct is what helped me find that best path.
mhm.
Versus I think if I had been optimizing for I want to build $1 billion company that works on healthcare, that would have been a more like structured way of thinking through a problem. But I don't think I would have gotten here yet
Mm.
if I had thought that way. But
I mean, it's maybe
I don't
something
know.
to lean into also. I mean, and that's, kind of going back to
Yeah.
kind of this maybe conformitist, somehow also mindset in the value or in our tech industry in general, that like there's, I'm making up numbers now, but right, like okay, 90% of companies, the founder kind of has, those kind of characteristics and character traits, which is why, VCs filter for that, etc. And we end up getting like, this idea that this is kind of how you have to be in order to build a successful company. Um,
Yeah.
whereas maybe it's, the opposite, just fits better to that person, to you.
Yeah, I
That's
don't
that.
know.
Yeah.
The experiment hasn't been run fully yet.
Exa-
I do think the negative of it is like you're more in tune. Like one thing I struggle with, and like one personal development aspect for me is a lot of it's very like emotionally driven. It's very like personal. A lot of this, and sometimes
Mhm,
it's difficult to make decisions or the deal with the grit
mhm.
when it's like loyal is personal to me. It's not versus I don't know if a photo sharing app would be
Sure.
as personal, right? As like this is to me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I've never worked with something like that, but maybe it is. Not no offense to any photo app
Sure.
founders, but yeah, it's just like a thing. Um,
I wanted to
yeah.
ask you a question that I ask everybody on the show. It's actually the only question, and that is around sort of iteration, and pivoting. And
Mm.
I wonder, like, you seem to think a lot in in patterns and in models, etc. So let's see how you're going to answer this one. Like, what's the mental model that you kind of use in order to make that decision whether to persevere with an idea, a product, a feature, or to pivot? And what do you think generally, has served you better in the past? Is it that?
Yeah. I mean, I think
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what served me, so like the original idea for Loyal is actually very different from like an execution standpoint and where we are today.
Hmm.
Like dog lifespan extending drugs was obviously conserved, but every aspect of how we're going to do that is completely different from my seed raise to now.
Hmm.
I think one of my strengths as a founder, and one that I think founders need to have, is not being emotionally attached to, again, anything but like that outcome goal, and pivoting strongly and with conviction upon the reception of new data. So I don't know if that's like a mental model, but I think it's like I'm always like my mind can be changed on basically anything. Um, and there's very few things like I try not to get like like, oh, I like the initial like concept for what the drug was going to be
Hmm.
was my idea. It was me. I had worked on a lot. Like there had been a lot of energy put into this proposal, this concept. And then I hired a couple of people who know more than I do, and there's a number of reasons from like manufacturing, feasibility, COGS, da 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 da. They made it clear that I was wrong. And I think there's like two reactions you can have there. One is to be like, no, I'm right, and like put your foot down. And I could have, and like I'm the boss, and they would have had to do what I wanted them to do. Or it's just be like, okay, here are the assumptions I had. Here are all the reasons those assumptions are wrong. Or here's like new assumptions I wasn't even cognizant I had. Therefore, we're gonna go and do X. Like fundamentally, like my management style is very much like find the best people in the world and empower them. And that's I really just see that as my job. I don't know if that would work for every type of startup. I think for this kind of startup where it's a very technical problem, it works really well because I just basically like cheering on, help people think through problems, set the goalposts of like lifespan extension, which people often want to like navigate away from because it's a hard
Hmm.
goalpost, right? There's like mountain ranges in between. But then say like figure out your best path, and that's worked very well for me.
And that is that something I often hear founders say, they had to develop into that, right? Like into letting go, into stop micromanaging, into, not wanting to control everything. Like that was something natural to you. You start a company, you get people on board and you empower them to do their thing.
I've never I mean, I maybe ask the team, but I have never cognizantly micromanage. I think it's like an ego thing. Like I just don't fool myself into thinking that I'm smarter than my team. Like I am like smarter or better or whatever at like very specific CEO things. Like I'm obviously the best fundraiser on the team. I'm the best, hoorah person on the team, but I'm not the best at like anything else.
Mm,
And if I was, I think I'd be bad hiring, which
mm,
is also often something you see, right? Like people like subconsciously hire people worse than them because it makes them feel better.
mm. Good point. Um, Two more questions. Well, one we kind of touched upon, which is sort of, how do you see your role, moving forward as the company grows? But I think we've kind of touched upon that.
Yeah.
So maybe let's, kind of just finish up by mindful of the time. We only have a few more minutes left, but I wanted to talk about a little bit sort of mental health, work-life balance,
Mm.
and running a company and being in this sort of high pressure pot of Silicon Valley. How do you balance it all? And also like when you see these sort of patterns that we've spoken about, right? I'm always interested in, you know, it it to me it often can seem also that people that very much try to conform to that very how should I put it, like this kind of optimizing mindsets to continuously optimize every detail of their own performance. It can lead for some people to too much pressure, to burnout, depression, etc. What are your thoughts around that?
I have loads of thoughts about this actually. I'll try to be concise. So I've worked as an exec coach since the first day of Loyal, and I remember one of the first things we talked about is um, a lot of founders have it's like kind of like a meme, and I'm not sure if it's a healthy meme. I'm not going to put an opinion around it that like you have to be a little bit broken to want to start a company. That's definitely true for me. Like I am like definitely broken in quite a few ways. That thankfully don't interfere with like the company running stuff, but like I've actually like learned how to like weaponize a lot of that to make me a lot better of an operator than I think I would have been on average. And that's a thing that I've seen in a lot of founders and a lot of the best founders is, and something that my exec coach actually has to deal with, because a lot of people have this like perception that if they deal with their anxiety or whatever, that then they won't be as good, right? Like if you are self-accepting, then kind of like what you were saying earlier, then you're not going to have the growth mindset that you need to build a company. Yeah, like I wrote something about the social implications of building a startup, and one that was actually one of them is that you have to be like, I'm constantly analyzing in every meeting and every interaction how I'm doing, what I do better, what did I say that was weird, this, that, or another. And it's and you're also always having to look around corners for like all the things that could kill you in the future, and all the reasons why you like messed up this like really important thing that you were doing. And I think you have to have that mindset, but it is very, very, very difficult to firewall it to just your professional life. And often, if you're a startup founder, your professional life is your personal life. Like if Loyal died, like my social life would tank also, right? Because it's just like everything overlaps here in the valley, and you kind of become like your company. I'm the embodiment of Loyal, and yeah, you have social cred or whatever around building a company. So I don't know.
But is that something you consciously just live with, or do you really
Yeah.
think it has to be this way? I mean, if we are not even our thoughts, right? If mindfulness teaches us that, should we really be our company?
I mean, I don't know if I'm the best one to give advice on this, because I actually kind of lean into the pathological side of it. I'm not saying that's healthy. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do. I haven't found another way personally. Like it's like an afterburner, right? Like it's so exhausting. Like I don't sleep enough. Like I'm stressed a lot. Like I'm constantly like dropping a billion things so I can like get done the one thing that's like 10 hours late. And then I do something else, because it's like you're always like messing up. And I don't know if there's a way, like the startups are chaos. And I think you just have to, I don't know. I want to believe there's a way to build them in a way that's not like, continuously painful, but I also don't want to like pretend like that is possible and kind of delude people into thinking that. But I don't know. I don't know if I'm the best one to give advice on this. I might just be like totally indoctrinated into toxicity, which is a lot of Silicon Valley.
Well, I hope you'll find the path that works for you, that makes you happy, and that makes Loyal successful. So thank you so much for being on the show, and I hope
Yeah.
to welcome you in Berlin sometime in our, well,
Yes.
hopefully, back to normal physical event.
I would love that. I miss Germany so much.
Thank you so much, Celine.